first panel this afternoon, it's session 1. We are going to be talking about managing key internet infrastructure. We're going to talk about resources, enhancing the multi-stakeholder model of internet policy making and governance in South Africa. And it's a great honor, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome the moderator of this particular panel. It's none other than Advocate Zanyiwe Ntatisi Asare, who's the director at Digitally Legal. So please come and join me on stage. Welcome to you, Advocate. And Advocate Asare will be joined by Mr. Neil Dundas, who's the CEO of the Domain Name Services Pty Limited. And unfortunately, Ms. Veronica Motlautsi, who's the non-executive board member, is not able to join us this morning, but Mr. Jabulani Nhlapo, Chief Strategist, Network and Internet Security for CETA, will be joining us on this particular.
We're a technical registry service provider to the ZA Central Registry and the ZA Domain Name Authority. And I've been involved in the domain name industry since the late 90s. I'm very involved with CO.za in particular, but other second level domains and .za. And I've got to know quite a lot of other stakeholders and people in the industry. So I'm quite happy and honored to be here today and to contribute to the discussion. Thanks.
So I'm going to start by firstly asking, do you have any presentations that we'd like to share? If not, we can go right into, the dialogue, the questioning, and really just getting an understanding of this topic and delving into the meat of it.
I have some slides, but I don't know how easy it is to share them with everyone, but I'm happy just to talk about them in general if that would suit everyone. Looks like we might have lost the projector. So it's already up to you how you want to run with this. We can talk to it, or if there's an opportunity, I can put some slides up and share them on the Zoom room.
Okay, that's not an issue. I just want to confirm, can you hear me online?
Loud and clear.
Okay. All right, so let's start with this. Maybe we can start with you, Neil. What is your definition of key or critical infrastructure? Let's have you start that conversation, and then I'll have a follow-up question. What is a multi-stakeholder approach to managing this key infrastructure, in your opinion?
Okay, so it's one of those subjects that is so broad when you present it with it, and you draw a couple of automatic conclusions because we're involved in the industry on a daily basis. We just assume everything we do is critical and it's critically important to the internet, and we answer that question that whatever we're doing is part of critical infrastructure. But I think we do need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture in terms of, what are we trying to get with when we talk about key or critical internet infrastructure? And where does this term come from? What's the genesis of all of it? And if we can answer that, we can also then answer subsequent questions of whether the DNS in particular and .za with a further focus is also critical infrastructure. So what I basically did is I had an automatic assumption that the domain name system, the stuff that we work on, registry systems, these are all part of critical infrastructure, and there's a knock-on effect if something is disrupted when it comes to those functions. But taking a step back, let's have a look at critical infrastructure as a whole. And to me, from what I've seen in terms of research papers and articles, critical infrastructure is basically infrastructure and functions that are so vital to the interests of a country that their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on the country's security, on public health and safety. So that's quite a criteria that you need to achieve in order to qualify as what is generally understood as critical infrastructure. Another definition that I've come across is that critical infrastructure is essential for maintaining society, and the disruption of which will impact society and the economy. Okay, so let's use that as the criteria by which we judge whether the issues that we're working on, internet in particular, falls within that category of critical infrastructure. Because if it does, we can then look at consequences, risks, and threats that would be applicable to critical infrastructure. What I did is when I was looking into the subject matter is I came across an interesting case study in the US. And the US federal government has created an agency called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's a bit of a mouthful, but their acronym is CISA. a very interesting agency that's created by the US government specifically to look at critical infrastructure. And so basically, CISA has been established to take the lead on the US national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to cyber and physical infrastructure. And CISA in particular has identified 16 sectors that constitute critical infrastructure. And out of those 16 sectors, communications and information technology constitute 2. So other than public safety, defense, health, water and sanitation, communications and information technology are earmarked and focused on as critical infrastructure sectors. And they specifically focus plans and stakeholder interaction around those sectors in order to protect that critical infrastructure. So that tells me that the type of industry we're involved in, the ICT type of industry and the internet industry, has already been earmarking countries like the US and protection. So according to CISA, when they're looking at something like information technology and determining how that is critical infrastructure, businesses and governments, academia and private citizens are increasingly dependent upon the functions and infrastructure of the information technology sector. The IT sector is therefore central to the well-being of the nation's security, economy, public health, and safety. So they're basically placing ICT at the center of a lot of critical infrastructure.
Really, you've drawn that up. And I think I'd like us to hear from a government's perspective, what does critical infrastructure look like? And I'd like us to, within your definition, also look at when we talk about infrastructure from a very traditional sense, we speak about investment, we look very long term. And as you're speaking, there's this evolving nature, ever evolving and rapidly changing nature of ICTs. What does that look like from a government perspective, especially, being the main investor in this infrastructure that we're talking about? Could you give us a definition that involves that?
Thank you. I think maybe I should start by saying the ability to develop and create has been at the heart of that ZADNA namespace, if I can put it that way, and it is growing remarkably within the society in SA. And the internet on its own has a long-regarded diversification of infrastructure, and it's a critical element in its architecture, and it's very founding of the network. So we try to get an infrastructure that will be a self-healing infrastructure that is not reliant or that will have a single point of failures, because that's the only way to be able to sustain in terms of getting security and moving forward in terms of your network security. Because the only important thing that is needed, and DNS also does that, is that you get resources which are very with different platforms and different applications that don't rely on using a singular type of device. If you have your servers, if you have your devices in your network, they need to be at least redundant, and not only physically so, but let it be redundant in terms of the different platforms they're using, the different applications. You can have your one primary server that's using a single technology in terms of processing your information, and have a secondary one using another one, so that we can avoid the vulnerabilities in terms of cyber attacks. So I think in our point of view, we are looking into diversifying and also having a redundant setup that will be a self-healing network, or a network that will avoid a great single point of failures.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Nhlapo. I think we'll get into redundancy and strategy around new technologies towards the end. I want to ask you guys a very interesting question. At least I think it's interesting. if I were to put out a scenario, let's reverse engineer the topics. The topic is management of key or critical infrastructures and using a multi-stakeholder approach. So you delved into it. Oh, well, not delved into it, you touched on it quite slightly in the beginning, about what the world would look like. What would the world look like with lack of not even adequate management, but lack of key infrastructure management? What are we exposed to? What are the risks for the individual? So from a civil society perspective, what are the risks for private sector? What are the risks for government and really the country at large? If you could give us your view, and I'd also like to hear Mr. Nhlapo's view, because I think the best way of learning is knowing what could go wrong if we don't invest in this particular topic or do the right thing. So what's your view, Neil?
Okay, so I think we've come to the conclusion now that the internet constitutes critical infrastructure, and the one thing that we need to appreciate is that it's become a delivery vehicle for essential services globally. And not just in the South African context, not just essential services, the internet is also used for economic and social growth and development. So that it has a social impact as well. So it makes it even more important. It makes the impacts of a disruption even broadly felt. But there's also an interdependency between other critical sectors like, let's say international trade, transport, on the internet. So if something had to happen to critical internet infrastructure, it could have a knock-on effect on other sectors, on the broader economy, on the broader society. So the internet is very, very pivotal, not just in its own right for the type of service that it provides, but it's a linchpin position in terms of the broader society and economic structures. So from that perspective, the implications of a failure on the internet from internet infrastructure can be quite widespread. Some of the risks that that you've raised, or threats, let's call it, threats to critical internet infrastructure. And there I agree with Mr. Nhlapo that you have to actually look at resiliency and security of this infrastructure, because technologies change, there are threats and failures, it's dynamic, it will change. So you need to be on top of it, and you need to build up a very sound, robust defense against failures or disruptions to your critical internet infrastructure. But some of the threats would include obvious things like hardware and equipment failures. The internet is made up of many, many routers and machines, connections and databases, and they're susceptible to hardware failures and equipment failures. You have to harden your infrastructure to be able to deal with those failures. Natural disasters is another one. We've seen natural disasters impacting the internet in other countries, tsunamis and volcanoes and these type of things. Cyber attacks. Now, when we think of cyber attacks, we're automatically thinking of cybercrime. And it is a huge element, and it does impact a lot of commercial rights and a lot of individuals out there. But when I talk about cyber attacks, I'm also thinking about it from a country perspective, about one country launching a cyber attack against another country, trying to disrupt critical infrastructures by targeting internet infrastructure. That's a possibility. How do you harden those systems so that, and make them more resilient, so that you can defend as a country against other countries? There's just two more others. Energy and telecommunications outages is another major threat for critical infrastructure. And then the cascading effect within the ICT sector itself. In other words, if you take down one part of an ICT network or the internet, it can affect another part. And then lastly, and interestingly enough, human factors. Human factors pose a significant threat to critical internet infrastructure. And there's a research paper that says that up to 50% of internet disruptions are actually caused by human-related failures. So there's a lot of threats that apply to the critical internet infrastructure. And these are the threats in a multi-stakeholder process that you need to focus on and try bringing a bit more robustness and resilience into those systems.
Okay, great. So hyperconnectivity, organizational elements, technical elements. So we're looking at the human factor, we're looking at the hardware itself. Mr. Nhlapo, I'd like your view. What anarchy, what world would we be living in if we did not have adequate management of critical infrastructures, at least from a government perspective? And I know that I'm nitpicking on you, but I'd like us to also speak about, the definition of data sovereignty. Would data fall under the definition of key infrastructure in the world that we live in?
Oh yes, thank you for the question. I think firstly, what I'd like to highlight, and I'd just like to say, I think the world has evolved a lot in terms of technology, and everyone, including kids as early as 5 years, they rely on technology. And if we, as human beings, we don't have a technology or that will be resourceful to our generation, and we don't get access to it as much or as often as we want to, obviously we'll have a whole lot of issues in terms of surviving in our daily normal routines, because I think we've already depending on technology a lot. And most of the things that for us to secure this critical infrastructures, we need to have an infrastructure that will not cause us to lose revenue whenever there's issues. Because if there's issues within the infrastructure, if our data is not clearly protected, we'll lose business. Secondly, we'll lose clientele. If you are servicing a customer and your infrastructure is forever failing and you don't give them the service that they require, they'll definitely move from you to another service provider that will provide them with what they need. And that's what we see also in our sector as well, that if a client is not happy, they'll definitely move to a better client. And we need to get the systems that we protect the data with as much as we can, manage it correctly, so that we invest in automated systems, so that we don't have to have a more manual or human intervention as much as possible, because automation, it's where we're moving, and it helps because it gives your network a self-healing network, a network that will be resilient, a network that will avoid having a human intervention where it might cause issues or maybe downtimes in terms of management.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Tlhapo, I think we're having slight difficulty hearing you. The audio quality is not too great, but I'm going to ask the last question that I asked you to Neil here on my side. Neil, data and data sovereignty, does that fall under critical infrastructure?
So again, the way you would answer that is you would look at the criteria we've established, and that is whether that data, if it was compromised or disrupted in some form or another, would have an impact on society or the economy. And if the answer is yes, then yes, it would be critical infrastructure. My guess would be there would certainly be elements of data out there, large swathes of data that would fall into that category. But, and I just want to make this point, because it's about critical internet infrastructure, because the way the internet has been created, because of the way it's administered and develops, there's a huge amount of interdependence and interconnection. So you can't just look at securing critical infrastructure in one place. It's broadly widespread. That's what makes the multi-stakeholder approach to managing critical infrastructure so important. It's because it's not in one place. You can't just put a wall around it and try and protect it. The network is as strong as its weakest point, basically. So, if you're looking at a natural event or a malicious event like a cyber attack, they're going to target the weakest points, and that's going to have a knock-on effect to other points. And that could be, data could be that weakest point. And that could impact broader things. Think of bringing down the financial services sector. It's quite conceivable that if you attack a particular component of critical internet infrastructure, that you could have a huge impact on the financial services sector, on the economy, on the stock exchange, banking, on social services. So the implications are huge. It's just finding that vulnerable point and exploiting it. Or it could just happen to you, it could be a natural disaster, as I said, or human factor. So the issue of critical internet infrastructure is trying to get a broad resilience across that network, all the different elements, trying to get multiple stakeholders who are running their own networks, public networks, getting them to work together to make it more resilient and dependable, so that there's the weak points are far and few between.
So let's jump into that. We'll try Mr. Tlhapo just shortly. So we're speaking about resilience, we're speaking about patching, we're speaking about figuring out these weak points, and this comes with capacity. We know that Africa has a human capital index shortage when it comes to IT, ICTs, and the specialties that you're speaking about. What are we doing as South Africa, at least from a private sector perspective, and also throw this to Ms. Nhlapo, to create that capacity and to ensure that we're not outsourcing for these kind of jobs, and we're not outsourcing for that insight from a South African perspective? What are we doing from a private sector perspective? We'll go to you, and then we'll go to Ms. Nhlapo shortly.
So, I'm not completely against the concept of outsourcing or getting in different skills. I think the answer is more not trying to do this by yourself. And collaboration, coordination is key. Multi-stakeholders basically is key to actually getting to the bottom of these things. So whether you're looking after your particular part of the internet or your ICT infrastructure, you also want to help your neighbor and their neighbor and their neighbor firm up their parts of the infrastructure so that you can rely on each other. And that case study I mentioned in the beginning, CISA, the US federal agency, they actually put themselves out to be a coordinator in a multi-stakeholder environment. So that's the real power that they've identified in protecting critical infrastructure. And that is bringing people together from all different sectors, from the private sector, from the public sector, academia, bringing them together so that they can collectively identify the weak points and then address them as a collective. And I think that's where the discussion must be elevated, as opposed to, whether you're doing it yourself, if you have the requisite skills, you need to look at the bigger picture when it comes to things like this. Obviously, you need to look on in your own living room first, and you need to make sure you got your stuff sorted out. And you need to develop skills around, like I said, human factors do contribute to a large amount of disruptions to critical infrastructure. So you definitely get the right skills on board. Definitely make sure that there's continual skills development and evolving of those skills, because these threats change every day.
Thank you. Ms. Nhlapo, something that can lead us to the jurisdictional elements of managing critical infrastructure. So we say we want a multi-stakeholder approach. We're agreeing that we need to be open with, investing in our own, human capacity from a capabilities perspective, but also being open to getting skills from outside, right? Jurisdictional elements. So we are speaking about data, really. If we think about critical infrastructure, we speak about the protection of data, protection of hardware, protection of all sorts, right? Jurisdictional issues. Our legislation currently doesn't really speak to the model that you just spoke to, Neil, right? From a protection perspective. What do we do to enhance? And I'll use a small example. So for instance, multi-stakeholder approach internally, the protection of personal information speaks about ensuring that the individual within this organization understands how to use whatever investments that you've placed in your organization, whether it be hardware, whether it be cybersecurity software, whatever it is, ensure that everybody within your organization understands what you've invested. Now, how do we ensure that our people within South Africa understand what that means from a jurisdictional perspective?
Very difficult question. I'm not sure I have the answer to it, but I think I'll walk that back a little bit and just say that, again, when it comes to critical internet infrastructure, data might be a part of that. We operate in an environment. The internet works in an environment that's transported. A lot of the people that help build the internet in South Africa and internationally have cooperated with each other for many, many years, and this has led to the formation of this fantastic infrastructure that we use today in so many different spheres. So I think being aware about national issues and international issues, standards, policies, having that knowledge, continuously evolving that knowledge is important to help you manage your part, your own corporate infrastructure. And that's, again, I want to come back to the multi-stakeholderism, because it's really about bringing these different skill sets together and having discussions and engagements, and then coming up with a collective point of view that you can go and implement independently from each other. So the Internet Society, if I can just make a remark, the Internet Society has actually got a very good model when it comes to the multi-stakeholder approach, because remember that the Internet's created on a multi-stakeholder system. The Internet Society says the multi-stakeholder approach works best in issues where decisions impact a wide and distributed range of people and interests, the Internet. There are overlapping rights and responsibilities across sectors and borders, the multi-jurisdictional issue that you've just mentioned. There are different forms of expertise needed, such as technical expertise. And the legitimacy and acceptance of decisions directly impacts implementation. So this is why you would use a multi-stakeholder approach, is to get this legitimacy, to get the knowledge and the skills all on board, and to come up with solutions that are then implemented across the board, that there's buy-in to these solutions. So that's the nub of why multi-stakeholderism is so critical to hardening and making the internet infrastructure more resilient. You need all of these skills and these different points of view together to share knowledge and to come up with action plans and then to implement it in a legitimate way.
Absolutely, I agree. Good answer to a question you wanted to throw away, but let's speak about blockchain technology, speak about what that means for the future of critical infrastructure management. However, we don't have time. And I also would have liked us to speak about the Electronic and Communications Transaction Act, you know, when we speak about policy. But before I do go, I would like to forward the audience 2 questions, if anybody does have. And you, thank you so much. So we got, I'm very happy to talk to you. Otherwise, will you? Fantastic. Okay. Do we? Or we could share this one. Okay, great. Brace yourself, guys. These questions, I think we need a moment of silence before the question.
Good morning. My name's Mark Elkins. A number of years ago, the Twin Towers were taken out in the US. A week later, the internet basically stopped in South Africa. So what happened and why will that not happen again? I'm sure, Neil, you can answer this.
Well, I can certainly say that the Americans learned from that, and they're looking at critical infrastructure. I think what happened there was a critical piece of internet infrastructure was taken out, and it had a knock-on effect, and South Africa felt the effects ultimately. It's what we've been saying. You have to look at all eventualities. You have to look at the entire system. You have to look at the weak points, and you have to build robustness and security in those points. You're probably never going to get away from an event like that. I think the term is the most dangerous vulnerability is hiding in the many interdependencies across different infrastructures. And you have to accept that. What I like and what I think is an effective way of dealing with this is to do something similar to what the Americans have done when it comes to looking at critical infrastructure as an interest sector in its own right, and identifying these things and then coordinating efforts to make them more robust, rather than trying to sort of create a firewall around them and trying to protect them in isolation. Let's bring all the people together and let's have a discussion around how do we make it better.
I think that was a good question.
But we also, I mean, to that point, I mean, when that happened, we had SAT3 only available as an undersea cable, and now we've got lots of undersea cables and lots of redundancy as well, which is a very different place to then.
Yeah. So, okay, I mean, I guess if we were sitting then and we were looking at critical infrastructure and we identified that as a weak point, then building more redundancy in terms of the network connectivity would have been on our agenda. But we didn't know that. We're looking at it in hindsight now. And that has happened, and it might not have the same impact as what it would have then as it does now.
Yeah.
And I guess that's why it's a really good thing that we had this balance of, you know, the government being able to speak to us about this, and also private sector. When we speak about co-creating a multi-stakeholder approach, being able to say, guys, we didn't have this, let's all sit together and co-create a solution and be, you know, have foresight, be creative in solution making when it comes to critical infrastructure. You've got another question. Okay,
There's a question.
Sorry, we're not going to take your question, Mark.
Just got one there in the middle.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Jabu Khatebe. Thanks, Neil and the other presenter for the good presentations. First and foremost, let me start off by saying, I think I subscribe to Neil's definition of key infrastructure, the first one. That's the first one. But the second thing is, you know, we have discussed the issue of key infrastructure within our own parameters. And as Neil indicated, some of these things become national issues. And I would like to believe that partnerships are critical when they become national issues. I wonder, do you have any ideas how we can forge those partnerships when these matters are of national importance? Not only that, especially taking into consideration that, the people responsible or the national security issues are not really issues of multi-stakeholder engagement. So it makes for that partnership I don't know whether you have any views on that.
I think it's exactly the issue that the US federal government has grappled with, and that is multilateralism is almost the dire opposite of multi-stakeholderism. And a lot of actions and protections that governments have brought into a case didn't really involve multi-stakeholders until the internet came about, which was developed around multi-stakeholder approach. And this is where I think the evolution of threat mitigation and identification came about. The US government identified, hang on, the internet has changed the game here. So many of these other critical infrastructures, whether it's water, sanitation, law enforcement, now depend on the internet. But we can't change the internet from a government perspective because the vast majority of critical internet infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. So how do we bring these guys in? And so this agency that they've created, its main job is coordinating private and the public sector to identify these threats and then to develop mitigation strategies against it. And I think that's what we're missing in South Africa. We actually need an agency or an organization to take a step back and say, let's not try and control anything. Let's just bring the right people together, sit down in a forum where we can have buy-in, come up with the threats, come up with the ways that we can fix this, and then have them implement it. Rather than controlling them to implement it, make it a good idea to implement it. Get the buy-in from the private sector and the academia and all these other stakeholders. I think that's what we're missing in South Africa. We need that catalyst, someone to bring us together, disarm us from carrying out particular positions, whether it's government or the private sector, and say this is in the public interest now. This is something against the national interest. We need to secure this stuff. You need to secure your part of the internet. We secure our part of the internet, and we secure this critical infrastructure over here. Together, it makes it all stronger. And I think that's the attitude we need to have. The US have made that change. They've evolved to that. And I think we in South Africa need to do the same. We need to understand this is beyond any single entity's control. We need to get everyone involved.
Thank you. So bottom-up approach, which if you think about it, is at the core of multi-stakeholderism. Tongue twister. We're going to give you, Mark, your opportunity.
You can't see through the poll here. So there's one question over there at the back.
Hi,
Sorry,
Hi,
Mark.
Paul here. I'm not going to preempt my discussion on the next panel. So I've just got a very sort of clarity-seeking question. My reading of ECTA and a lot of the discussion around key infrastructure tends to operate on a binary. Either something is considered key infrastructure or it's not key infrastructure. And I'm just wondering if the panel has any thoughts on whether that's the wrong way to think about it, whether we shouldn't think of certain infrastructure as more key than other infrastructure. When we think about critical, is there this sort of layered approach and infrastructure that we can view as lower down on the ring, and whether that's a more resilient way to look at it, or whether we should sort of say, if it's key infrastructure, it's key and it needs to, be viewed as a national resource and that sort of thing.
Define key infrastructure.
Well, what I'm asking is
just like 2 or 3 examples.
2 or 3 examples. So, DNS registry system. Would you regard your backup servers or secondary servers as less key than the primary resources?
To answer Paul's question or address Paul's question, I think some things are relatively easy to identify as critical internet infrastructure. I would say the DNS registry, or the domain registry system, ZA registry system, sure, that could be critical infrastructure. But that's actually not the point that we need to be concerned about. We need to be concerned about the risk to the critical infrastructure. So this could mean that one router or one switch sitting somewhere in some internet exchange is the weak point. We might not identify that as critical infrastructure, but it poses a risk to the critical infrastructure because it's the weak point to get to it. So you need a broad-based plan. You need to regard the internet as critical infrastructure as a whole, with all its small pieces and the big pieces and the more substantive pieces. And that's why you need the broadest possible grouping of people to come together and to work on their bits of the puzzle. Because if you just focus on those bits that you deem critical, you're going to miss a trick, and someone's going to figure that out. And you're going to be very surprised at the end of the day, because suddenly this infrastructure that you thought was protected is vulnerable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that brings us to the conclusion of our panel discussion today. I think we can summarize this as really seeing critical infrastructure as multifaceted, also understanding that we might need to sit down as a country and remodel our approach towards how internet governance, especially around critical infrastructures, is undertaken by the country. You know, we do have a certain model, we have been doing things a certain way, but the real question here, I think, as Neil was always emphasizing on, is how are we mitigating the risk? Are we realistic with how we're approaching the management of critical or key infrastructures in the country? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for affording us your time. This is a really interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to us having more of these. Thank you from us. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Advocate Zaniwe and Tatise Asare, give a round of applause. It was fantastic. Well done. And a big thank you as well to the other two panelists, Neil Dundas, thank you so much, as well as Jabulani Nhlapo, who has joined us virtually. Thank you very much to you.